Genesis chapter 9. So, actually we'll start it at Genesis chapter 8, verse 20. No, it's chapter, I'm sorry, we're at chapter 8. We're not at chapter 9, we're at chapter 8. So, chapter 7 brings us through the end of the flood proper, and then from chapter 8 and following we have the receding of the flood. And we see that it takes a significant amount of time So we're going to compare verse 24 here. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days, and we'll see that 150 days is the amount of time it takes for the waters to abate, because it will come to verse 3 here. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed, and the rain from the heavens was restrained. And the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. And so, continuing, and in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. And in the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. And so, it takes almost almost 6 months. It takes about 6 months, almost 6 months before the earth before it was safe for Noah and his family to leave the ark. So the extent of the flood was such that it took that long for the waters to withdraw from the earth. We don't know we have this sentence that God made wind blow over the earth and the waters subsided, and what the significance of that is, we're not sure. The wind in this case being somehow connected probably to the rain ceasing. And at the end of 40 days, so this would be 40 days after the mountains' tops were seen, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent forth a raven. It went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent a dove forth from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand, and he took her, and he brought her into the ark with him. And he waited another 7 days. And again he sent forth the dove out of the ark, and the dove came back to him in the evening, and behold, in her mouth was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. And so the question then is, how is it that the dove was able to find an olive leaf within a week's time? Which is an interesting question. Because before it had nowhere to land, and now it does. And the only possibility here is that the dove found some place where the trees survived the flood, and there were still leaves on the trees. Then he waited another 7 days and sent forth the dove, and she did not return to him anymore, meaning that the dove had gone and found a place to nest on its own. In the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried from off the earth. The 601st year of what? Well, the only thing that makes sense based upon what we saw in the account of the time leading up to the flood was, I believe this is counting from the birth of Noah. Because Noah, we saw, lived 500 years before he had sons and daughters. And then we see it's at the 500th year that God gives him coming close to 500 years, that God gives him the command to build the ark. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. In the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. Then God said to Noah, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So Noah went out, his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him, and every beast and every creeping thing and every bird and everything that moves on the earth went out by families from the ark. And thus begins the restoration of the creation. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and he took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, "I will never again curse the ground because of man." So this is in fulfillment of the prophecy that we saw when Noah was born, that in this one, the curse will be removed. The curse going all the way back to Adam's to God cursing the ground when Adam was cast out of Eden. And so all of these things, when you take these references together, it's incorrect to say that the ground is still cursed like it was in Adam's day. And exactly like I said before, what this curse was, we do not know. Some say, though, that when this is the curse that it's referring to here, the curse of the earth, of the ground, was the flood itself. Okay, you can have that opinion, but it doesn't really quite fit when you take the reference that at Noah's birth, it was prophesied that the curse of the ground would be removed. A curse that was in effect at the time Noah was born, 500 years before the flood. And so it really doesn't seem to quite fit to say that this curse was the flood itself. "I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever strike down." And this is the other reason. So if you look at the context here, he refers to the curse of the ground, and then he refers to a second thing. "Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done." Now that was the flood. And so God is speaking of both things here, but he speaks of them as separate things. "While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease." From this time forward until the end, the normal flow of the seasons will continue. There's not going to be some catastrophe that changes how the entire climate of the earth, day and night, the cycles of the sun and the moon and the stars work. And so this should give us comfort that we should take all of these hand-waving about the climate change is going to destroy the human race and melt the sea caps and flood all the coastlands and we won't be able to farm them anymore. Set it aside. God has promised that until the end, the basic functioning of the earth isn't going to change. Doesn't mean there's not going to be bad weather, storms, and changing, that every season and every year is going to be the same. He doesn't say that. But he says the way things will proceed will continue now. And there will not be some catastrophe that changes them. And we know this is also from Jesus' promise, that it will be for us as it was in the days of Noah when the Son of Man comes. Because the flood was a huge break. I was like, this is not something that normally happens. The flow of the seasons is shattered by this flood. And as it was in the days of Noah, when everyone was eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage, living their lives as if there was no destruction or no change at all coming, then the flood came suddenly. That's how it's going to be in the day of Jesus. life from the standpoint of most people on earth will simply be normal. And then suddenly Jesus comes. You should also keep that in mind when you're trying to understand biblical prophecy and prophecies of the end, and not do what so many evangelicals have done, mostly, primarily evangelicals, but there's some others as well, and shove all of the prophecies of the end to a short period of time, like 7 to 15 years, right at the very end of the world, as if suddenly now then you're going to have all these terrible catastrophes that are happening on the earth, and then, only then Jesus comes. That's not what Jesus said. Noah, God says here in Genesis, that's not what's going to happen. Because yes, there will be catastrophes. There will be signs of the coming of Jesus. But people will simply take them as the normal course of creation. And then by the time of the end, people will be acting just like they did in the days of Noah. They won't even realize what's about to happen. The sudden destruction that comes upon the children of disobedience when Jesus comes to judge the living and the dead. All right. And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you, and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it, and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." Okay. And this is a very interesting thing. Yes, it's talking about a rainbow, but it's not referring to the colors of the rainbow. So when you see a rainbow, what do you see? What's its shape?
Bow.
An arc.
So when you say bow, what is that referring to? Is it like a bow tie?
A bow.
No, a bow is right, but is that like a bow tie?
No.
Nope. What is a bow that's shaped that way?
Where they shoot arrows at.
That's exactly right. A bow is a battle weapon, right? The archers used to shoot the enemies. So God's setting a bow in the heavens. Which direction is the bow pointed?
Up.
Up. It's not pointed down at the earth. It's pointed away from the earth. So this is the sign of this covenant that God makes. That he is not going to destroy the earth in the same manner that he did in the days of Noah. His bow, his battle bow, is pointed away from the earth. That's the key point of the sign of the covenant. The bow that happens when the clouds gather and the rains fall, and yet they're not rains that God is sending to destroy the earth. So that we will always remember his mercy. Now, what is it saying in connection with this covenant we shouldn't miss? Earlier in the verses, he said, earlier in 29, or in chapter 9, where is it here? Did I jump? I did. I'm sorry. Somehow I went from the end of chapter 8 and flipped over to verse 8. Okay, I'm sorry about that. We'll come back then. In connection with this, God says, the imagination of man's heart is evil continually. Right? I will never again curse the ground, because for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither again will I strike down every living creature. This covenant that God makes with Noah and with all future generations is in the context of Man is still evil, and from his very youth he is still turned against me. But I will be merciful. My bow will be pointed away from the children of men in this way, and I will not destroy them utterly. Isn't that interesting? Okay. So I missed the beginning of chapter 9. So Noah built an altar to the Lord. He made the sacrifices. There God says the promise. Later confirms it in this chapter. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So he'd already said this to the animals as they come out of the ark and disperse, that they're blessed to be especially fruitful, to regenerate the earth and to fill it with life so that it swarms with life once more. But also Noah and his sons. Now he says, the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird in the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be for food for you. As I have given you the green plants, I give you everything. And so, earlier in Genesis, we are not told that God specifically gave animals for food. We're specifically told he gave plants for food, but we're not specifically told that he gave animals for food. Isaiah, yes.
So, the water's not covering the earth, but it killed all life, all human life. There are islands where sheep live that weren't put there.
Isaiah. No. There's nothing there.
There's an island. There was an island where sheep and cattle lived,
Why are you saying this?
untouched by the
Because
flood.
you found a YouTube
Why
video
are you
about
saying
how
this?
people
Because would the
found
water
an island with animals on it.
have flooded it?
Everything was flooded in the entire land. All of it. And so any sheep and animals in the land after that were the ones that were preserved from the ark, and then they multiplied. So if you're thinking of islands as exist today, Isaiah, do not think about that.
But we didn't know that the flood covered the whole entire earth. We don't know if it did or didn't.
We know that the flood destroyed all living creatures and all humanity, and as far as whether or not it covered the entire earth, which is certainly completely in keeping with what the scripture says. If there was a part of the earth that it wasn't covered, what difference does it make to your question?
I was just wondering if there could have been life on that other.
The answer is the entire land where man was and beyond was entirely flooded, so there was no life left. It was a massive loss of life. And the animals of the ark are there to replenish that life.
Yeah, if God had left some animals on a certain part of the world that wasn't flooded, he would not have needed to it said, bless them with fertility. He's
the purpose of God blessed the animals, made them especially fruitful, so they'll swarm back over the earth and replenish the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Is what it says there. That's the purpose of those animals, to replenish the earth, to refill the earth with life.
And you can know for sure that all animals on the earth were killed and there was no other, because it says that right here. And all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing and every man.
You know that, So, when I said
it says all flesh died, it doesn't say all plants died, and that's in keeping with
right,
like the
and
bird from the
you have to understand, when I said before that if you're going to say that the flood did not cover the entire earth, then you must say, to be in keeping with the scriptures, that all humanity died. So if you want to take the whole earth or the whole land in a narrower sense, as it is sometimes often used in scripture, you can't use that to say that some humanity survived. That's the only point I was making before. You have to say all flesh died. all men whatsoever died. So I'm not I didn't say that to say that the flood didn't cover the whole earth. I'm saying that if you're going to take those particular words and phrases and use them in the narrower version of the whole earth, because it is true, the Bible does sometimes use that expression to not mean the entire planet, but the whole land as far as man is concerned, as far as the people there are concerned, then you can't contradict that Noah is the father of the entire human race as it exists today. That's my only point, okay? All right. The safest thing is to just simply say the whole earth. And
yeah, if you go back to Genesis 7, it says, I don't know that translation, this translation, the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills were covered. All the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered, and all flesh died. That moved on.
Right, and I made the point. I made the point last time that doesn't mean that the waters were high enough that they'd cover Mount Everest as it exists today. Because the
whole land was molded and formed as part of the flood into the state we see it now.
Yeah, if we take under the whole heaven to mean the entire earth, correct. And that is the safest way to take it. I only mention the other because I am not going to accuse someone of heresy if they believe that the flood was not worldwide but was still massive enough to completely wipe out all humanity and then leave them with no food, with Noah and his family, no animal resources, nothing on this barren landscape. That's all I'm saying. So, if you're going to draw specific geological or geographical conclusions, as I've mentioned many times up through Genesis, you have to keep it consistent with what God says in the text. The rest is in terms of a model that you may have for all these things happen. That's our speculation, and do not confuse our speculation with what God has said. All right, that's it. All right, so back to what. So we've got this. Back to what I was saying. In the earlier chapters, when God gave every green plant for food to man, we know that Abel was raising sheep, and perhaps it was only for wool. We're not told that any men were eating meat prior to the flood. Maybe they were and maybe they weren't, but we're not told it. And there is no place in Genesis where God gives the animals to man for food prior to the flood. But after the flood, here first, he explicitly does that the animals are also for food for you. People have speculated all sorts of things about why this would be. Some being that the flood made such a radical change that the plants would no longer be healthy enough to sustain man's life after the flood, because everything changed after the flood, and therefore it was necessary for man to become omnivores, to now also begin to eat meat. Is that the case? What do you think my answer is?
I don't know.
Correct.
You can also say there probably weren't too many plants alive after the flood. They were all fresh, so they needed the sustenance of the animals at the time, so that's why.
Possibly. But again, I'm not going to speculate beyond what it says here. Well, we can be certain that now, as he has given us the green plants, he also gives us he gives us everything. Now, the way it's phrased, I need to note, is not that this is it's you can't tell for sure if it's a new thing here in verse 3, 9 verse 3. As I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But it does seem to be a case that there's a specific change. Does that mean that if they had eaten animals before, it would have been sinful? Well, since we're not giving any prohibition or command regarding the animals, I think we just need to leave it there.
The next verse is very confusing.
All right. And for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning.
Oh.
Murder.
This translation is different.
Oh, it says, no, it says, but you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Okay. So this is flesh with its life, that is, its blood. The prohibition against eating blood began with Noah and continued into the to the Mosaic Law. So they would eat meat, but they would drain it of blood first, which is how all of our butchering is done to this day. We drain the blood away and then we butcher the animal. And the purpose, the point here is not that there's something intrinsically sinful in eating the blood of an animal. What does it say?
Should not eat flesh with its life, so don't take a leg off a lamb and leave it alive.
I do believe that that's the primary thing it's talking about. Okay, but, so you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your life blood I will require a reckoning. It's from every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. And so in other words, he's talking about murder, the killing of one man of another. If you take a man's blood, then this is what, so this is really a commandment of God. He's explicitly giving a commandment against murder. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. So notice the distinction here. First he talks about the animals. These are for you for food. But man is not one of the animals. Man is made in the image of God. The only punishment sufficient enough for a murderer is to lose his own life. If you take the life of a man, your life is forfeit. And so here is the first commandment given in written form, right here in chapter 9, and this after the flood. Now what do we have the commandments before that? Well, first commandments we have are, do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We get no more commandments from there to Noah.
Is be fruitful and multiply not considered a commandment? Is that considered just a blessing?
It is both. But you have to understand that not everything that God commands is part of it. You can't equate the term law and command. Repent and believe the gospel is also a command.
Okay.
But does that mean repent and believe the gospel is a law? So, be fruitful and multiply is a command, but it's also a blessing. Right? And so this is what Noah, so he tells Noah to be fruitful and multiply. Increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it. So the question, it's an excellent question. Is there a command for us to have children? Well, yes, there is. Absolutely. Within the means that God has made holy, He has commanded us and blessed us to be fruitful and multiply. Now, the interesting thing about this is, no past generation of humankind until the 20th century would have considered the command to be fruitful and have children anything but the richest blessing. Or prior to that time, barrenness, the inability to conceive and have children, was a curse. Absolute curse. It is only in the 20th century, with the rise of birth control, Planned Parenthood, and abortion, that suddenly people started viewing this command of God to be fruitful and multiply as a curse, not a blessing. And literally say, as they do, to have children is a sin, because you're hurting the earth by having children.
Can we find any other part in history that the assault on family has been, like any societies, where
Yes.
the assault on family has been
There was
the
always-
same as it is today?
It was always associated with demon worship. The sacrifice of your children, the shedding of your children's blood, and passing them through the fire and offering them up to
No,
idols.
but like, say, like Sodom was a widespread example of homosexuality
Right.
in a population. Is there any point through history we see an assault on the family in a
Not
given
not to this
population?
degree. Even they try to say, well, ancient Greece and Rome, homosexuality was accepted and common, and they're just ignoring history. It wasn't. It was made fun of. It was made fun of.
Yeah.
So they might not have considered it to be a sin, but they also considered it to be abnormal. Yes, Isaiah.
So abortion is breaking two commandments.
Abortion is
Killing and punishable by death, and not multiplying.
every commandment. Every sin is breaking more than one commandment. But abortion is a sin against your children. It's a sin against your descendants. It's a sin against your society, and it's a direct sin of murder.
Okay.
Okay. So the other thing I have to say about be fruitful and multiply. The natural, we learn about God explicitly in the scriptures, but getting back to my point earlier, where we were given no commandments from the time of Adam that are recorded to the time of Noah. And yet, the natural order of the creation reveals God's commandments and his law. It's written in the conscience. It's also written in life itself and how life works. And that the desire of a man for a woman is natural, and therefore the conceiving and bearing of children is natural. It's built into the order of creation that this is the way things are to be between men and women. They're to have children together. And so that's natural. What's unnatural is that they deny this and refuse to have children together. Or that they deny this and say, I love men instead of women, or women instead of men, is against the revealed law of God in nature. And so what does Paul say? He says, the invisible things of God were seen clearly from the beginning of creation, so that they're without excuse, that nobody can have the excuse when they're judged by God that I didn't know it was wrong. Paul says, yeah, they weren't given the law, and so when God judges them, they're going to judge them without the law. They're still going to get judged, because what they did is still sin. Now, what if they had the law and they did it anyway? Well, now they're going to be judged for that sin, but they're going to be judged for the fact that they also broke God's law explicitly because they were told and then they turned away from it. They'll be judged and perish with the law. And so, the nature of creation reveals God's law and will, and when man rebels against it, God still holds him accountable. And so, 2, when we come to this commandment of be fruitful and multiply, the nature of God's law and order clearly reveals it is his will that we have children. And he considers it a blessing, and every generation did until the time of the 20th century. Okay. We covered 8 through 17 earlier with the bow. 18. The sons of Noah were so one other thing about the bow, okay? It's connected to this promise, be fruitful and multiply. Because what was the bow saying? That God is not going to destroy the earth again. Your descendants and progeny will be safe. So what is that also a promise of in the case of Noah and Seth, or Shem? That God is not going to destroy their descendants. The bow is a promise of Christ.
Is in the Hebrew or Aramaic or whatever, going back to the original texts, is a rainbow described like the word? Is it
literally the same word. It's the same word. Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
It's interesting that that would be the only evidence, if that's the case, that its symbolism is tied to being a bow, that there was weapons of war prior to the flood.
Well, that's a good point. Well, we know that there's violence in all the earth, though. So they were at war. They were warring against each other. They had swords and weapons. They had weaponry for sure. I mean, we have the boasting and murder that was already taking place well before the flood. So, and I'll tell you one thing for sure: they weren't just having fist fights. Okay. Now let's finish up chapter 9. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed, which means populated. Okay, Noah began to be a man of the soil. He's a farmer. He planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk, and lay uncovered in his tent. He got stone cold drunk, passed out, and he was naked, sprawled out in his tent. And the tent flap was open, and anyone passing by could see him. And Ham, the father of Cain, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both of their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Shem is delighting in this, oh, look at dad, isn't that funny, and mocking his father and making fun of him. And evidently joined in this with his son Canaan, as we'll see here coming up. So not only doing this, but teaching his son to do it. So when Noah awoke from his wine and knew that his youngest son had done to him, knew what he had done, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." So this is why we think that Canaan was involved in the sin as well, probably with his father. Perhaps even Canaan is the one that began the sin, and Shem, being responsible for him as his father, joined him, or Ham, joined him in the sin as well. We don't know, but we can see that it seems that Canaan was also involved. So Canaan will be a servant to his brothers. That was literally fulfilled, because Canaan is the father of the Canaanites. The tribes of the Canaanites ultimately came from him. He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." And after the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Okay. So then, we'll get some hints about which peoples were descended from which sons in chapter 10. And in chapter 10, when we get into the genealogies, this is where, by the way, the Septuagint and the Hebrew Masoretic text that we have today wildly diverge. So when you see that there's shortened lifespans, just know that they weren't as short as this Hebrew text says. Because we know that the Hebrew text that the apostles and Jesus used had different numbers after the time of Noah, and that those numbers were 10.